Nietzsche places Amor Fati after eternal recurrence because eternal recurrence tests the limits of affirmation, but it does not yet describe what full affirmation looks like once the test has been faced. Eternal recurrence asks whether one could will life again. Amor Fati names the posture that makes such willing possible. Eternal recurrence confronts the individual with necessity. It removes hope, redemption, and progress, forcing a reckoning with life as it has been lived. Amor Fati does not repeat that confrontation. It responds to it. Where recurrence exposes, Amor Fati integrates. This sequencing matters. If Amor Fati were introduced earlier, it would sound like advice or consolation. Without the weight of recurrence, loving one's fate could be misunderstood as acceptance, coping, or psychological adjustment. Nietzsche avoids this by letting recurrence do the destructive work first. Amor Fati is not a softening of eternal recurrence. It is a deepening. Eternal recurrence asks whether one could endure the repetition of life. Amor Fati asks whether one could affirm necessity so completely that repetition no longer feels like a burden at all. This is why Amor Fati is not an emotional add-on. It is not a feeling layered onto suffering. It is a transformation in how necessity is interpreted. What recurrence forces into view, Amor Fati reinterprets without denial. Nietzsche is careful here. Amor Fati is not something one adopts to pass the test of recurrence. It cannot be willed into existence. It arises only if recurrence has been faced honestly and without escape. The placement also signals a shift in tone. Eternal recurrence is confrontational and heavy. Amor Fati is quieter. It does not announce itself. It names a condition that emerges when resentment has been exhausted and resistance has fallen away. By placing Amor Fati here, Nietzsche indicates that affirmation does not end with confrontation. It must stabilize. It must become a way of interpreting life rather than a moment of resolve. This is why Amor Fati follows recurrence rather than preceding it. Recurrence reveals whether life can be affirmed without conditions. Amor Fati describes what affirmation looks like once conditions have disappeared entirely. Nietzsche's sequence is deliberate. First, life is stripped of consolation. Then, and only then, the possibility of loving necessity appears. Not as instruction, but as consequence. Amor Fati does not solve the problem eternal recurrence raises. It answers it, not with argument, but with orientation. When Nietzsche speaks of Amor Fati, he means something far more demanding than acceptance. Love of fate is not resignation, not endurance, and not the decision to make peace with what cannot be changed. It names a transformation in how necessity itself is experienced. To accept fate is still to resist it inwardly. Acceptance tolerates necessity while wishing it were otherwise. Amor Fati removes the wish. What has happened is not merely endured, it is affirmed as necessary. Not because it was good, but because it belongs to the life one lives. This distinction is crucial. Amor Fati is not the claim that everything happens for a reason. Nietzsche rejects that consolation outright. There is no hidden justification waiting behind events. Loving fate does not mean believing that suffering was meant to happen, or that it served a higher purpose. Instead, Amor Fati affirms the thisness of life. What happened had to happen, not because it was planned, but because it is now part of existence. The past is no longer treated as a mistake to be corrected or a burden to be resented. This is why love matters. Endurance can coexist with resentment. Love cannot. To love fate is to stop placing life on trial. There is no appeal to how things could have been different. Counterfactual thinking collapses. Nietzsche's love of fate is therefore not sentimental. It does not soften pain. It does not reinterpret loss as blessing. It refuses to lie. What it changes is not the event, but the relation to it. Amor Fati also differs from indifference. Indifference withdraws care in order to avoid pain. Amor Fati deepens care. It says yes without detachment. It affirms without numbness. This is why Nietzsche treats Amor Fati as rare. Most people can endure necessity. Few can love it. Love requires that resentment has lost its grip. It requires that the desire for revenge against time has dissolved. When Nietzsche says love of fate, he means precisely this: the refusal to treat one's life as something that should have been otherwise. Nothing is filtered out, nothing is excused, nothing is denied. Amor Fati is the highest expression of affirmation because it affirms not only life, but the necessity of life as it has unfolded. Nietzsche draws a sharp line between endurance and amor fati. Endurance is often mistaken for strength, but for Nietzsche it remains a form of resistance. One endures what one cannot change while quietly wishing that things were otherwise. Amor Fati removes that wish entirely. Endurance treats life as something to be gotten through. It frames suffering as a test, a punishment, or a temporary obstacle. Even when endurance is dignified, it still positions life as adversary. The relationship remains adversarial. Amor Fati transforms that relationship. Life is no longer something endured under protest. It is embraced without conditions. What changes is not the amount of suffering, but the orientation toward it. This is why Nietzsche rejects coping as affirmation. Coping strategies reduce pain. They help one survive, but they do not reconcile one with necessity. One can cope and still resent. One can endure and still secretly reject life. Endurance also depends on temporality. One endures because one believes the hardship will pass, or that it will be redeemed later. Amor Fati breaks this structure. It does not lean on the future. It affirms what is, without postponement. Nietzsche is unsparing here. A life lived primarily through endurance has not yet been affirmed. It may be respectable, courageous, or admirable, but it is still oriented around getting through rather than saying yes. This distinction is uncomfortable because endurance is often praised. Moral systems reward it. Cultures celebrate it. Nietzsche does not deny its necessity, but he refuses to confuse necessity with affirmation. Amor Fati does not require the absence of struggle. It requires the absence of inner rebellion against what cannot be changed. The struggle may remain, the resistance does not. This is why Amor Fati cannot be cultivated through discipline alone. One cannot decide to stop resenting life, while still depending on endurance as one's mode of survival. Resentment dissolves only when resistance is exhausted. Nietzsche's point is not to condemn endurance, but to locate its limit. Endurance keeps life going. Amor Fati affirms it. Without this distinction, love of fate collapses into stoicism or resignation. Nietzsche insists on keeping it sharp. Amor Fati is not strength through endurance. It is strength through reconciliation with necessity. Amor Fati is often mistaken for a version of Stoicism, but Nietzsche is explicit that the resemblance is superficial. While both involve engagement with necessity, they diverge at a fundamental level in how they relate to control, emotion, and life itself. Stoicism aims at mastery through detachment. It teaches the individual to limit concern to what lies within their control and to withdraw emotional investment from what does not. Peace is achieved by narrowing the field of concern. The world is accepted by shrinking one's attachment to it. Nietzsche rejects this posture. Amor Fati does not reduce investment in life. It intensifies it. It does not retreat from what cannot be controlled. It embraces it fully. Where Stoicism seeks tranquility by insulating the self, Amor Fati risks exposure without protection. Stoic acceptance still contains an implicit hierarchy. Some things matter, others do not. Amor Fati refuses this sorting. Nothing is excluded. Even what wounds, diminishes, or destabilizes must be affirmed without remainder. This is why Nietzsche sees Stoicism as a form of self-protection. It trains the individual to remain untouched. Amor Fati abandons the desire to remain untouched. It does not seek calm. It seeks yes-saying. Stoicism also relies on rational distance. One reasons oneself into acceptance. Amor Fati cannot be reasoned into. It arises when resistance collapses, not when arguments succeed. The transformation is existential, not intellectual. Nietzsche is especially critical of the Stoic emphasis on control. Control is still opposition to life. It is an attempt to shape experience so that it does not hurt. Amor Fati gives up control altogether, not because control fails, but because it is no longer needed. This difference reveals why Amor Fati is more demanding than Stoic serenity. Stoicism limits suffering by limiting involvement. Amor Fati accepts suffering because it refuses to limit involvement. Nietzsche does not dismiss Stoicism as false. He sees it as appropriate under certain conditions of exhaustion. When life threatens to overwhelm, detachment preserves survival. But preservation is not affirmation. Amor Fati appears only when life no longer needs insulation. It marks a condition of strength, not restraint. Where Stoicism manages life, Amor Fati embraces it in full. This distinction is crucial. Without it, love of fate collapses into emotional withdrawal. Nietzsche insists on keeping the difference clear. Amor Fati is not peace through distance, but affirmation through proximity. At the center of Amor Fati lies Nietzsche's confrontation with necessity. Loving fate does not mean approving of everything that happens, nor does it mean believing that events were good or just. It means affirming that what has occurred had to occur, and that wishing otherwise is a form of resistance that drains life of its force. Necessity, for Nietzsche, is not metaphysical destiny. It is not the claim that the universe was planned or ordered toward a goal. Necessity means something more immediate. The past cannot be changed. What has happened is now woven into existence. To reject it is to reject one's own life. This is why Nietzsche treats regret as a central obstacle. Regret is not simply sadness about loss. It is the desire to undo what has been done. It imagines an alternate past and measures life against it. Amor Fati dissolves this comparison. There is no counterfactual past against which life is judged. To say it had to be this way is not to say it was right. It is to say that resistance to what cannot be undone is futile and corrosive. Loving necessity means withdrawing the demand that life justify itself according to imagined alternatives. This marks a decisive shift in interpretation. Events are no longer evaluated by asking whether they should have happened, but by recognizing that they are now inseparable from one's existence. What one is includes what one has suffered, lost, and failed to become. Nietzsche sees counterfactual thinking as a hidden form of resentment. It keeps the individual bound to an imaginary past, while life continues forward. Amor Fati cuts this bond. It refuses to measure life against what never was. This does not make suffering disappear. It changes its status. Pain is no longer interpreted as error or injustice. It becomes part of the texture of life, not redeemed, not excused, but affirmed as necessary. Necessity also collapses the desire for blame. If events had to happen as they did, then searching for someone or something to hold responsible becomes pointless. Amor Fati ends moral accounting without turning indifferent. This is why loving fate requires strength. Weakness clings to alternatives because it cannot bear the weight of necessity. Strength lets go of if only and what if, and stands within what is. Amor Fati therefore completes the confrontation begun by eternal recurrence. Recurrence forces acceptance of repetition. Amor Fati affirms the necessity of every moment that would be repeated. Here, affirmation becomes stable. It no longer depends on mood, success, or outcome. It rests on a reconciliation with time itself. Nietzsche insists that Amor Fati is not accessible to weakness, and by weakness, he does not mean moral failure or lack of virtue. He means a condition of life in which energy is insufficient to bear necessity without resentment. Loving fate requires strength because it demands the absence of inner resistance to what has been. Weakness experiences life primarily as burden. It feels acted upon rather than expressive. Under such conditions, necessity is felt as injustice. Events are interpreted in terms of what one deserved but did not receive, or what should not have happened. Amor Fati cannot arise where this interpretive posture dominates. Strength, by contrast, does not mean invulnerability. It means capacity, the capacity to integrate pain without turning it into accusation. A strong form of life does not need to assign blame in order to endure. It does not need to imagine an alternate past to justify itself. Nietzsche is clear that resentment is the great enemy here. Resentment fixes attention on what cannot be changed and converts powerlessness into moral judgment. As long as resentment governs interpretation, fate cannot be loved. It can only be endured or resisted. This is why Amor Fati cannot be taught as a practice. One cannot reason oneself out of resentment while still depending on it to organize meaning. Resentment dissolves only when it becomes unnecessary, when life no longer needs to accuse in order to persist. Strength also manifests as temporal integration. The strong individual does not split their life into acceptable and unacceptable chapters. The past is not quarantined, it is owned. What one has been is affirmed as what one is. Nietzsche emphasizes that this ownership is not pride. It is not the claim that one's life has gone well. It is the refusal to disown any part of it. Loving fate means refusing to place sections of one's existence under erasure. This is why Amor Fati cannot coexist with victimhood as an identity. Victimhood depends on the belief that one's life has been unjustly shaped by forces beyond oneself. Amor Fati does not deny harm, but it refuses to let harm define meaning. Strength, in Nietzsche's sense, is therefore not aggression or dominance. It is the ability to affirm necessity without bitterness. It is the capacity to say yes without qualification. This is rare not because it is morally demanding, but because it presupposes a surplus of life. Where life is barely endured, resistance is inevitable. Where life has force, resistance becomes unnecessary. Amor Fati is thus not a reward for virtue. It is an expression of vitality. It appears where life is strong enough to carry its own weight, including everything that has happened. Nietzsche is often accused of glorifying suffering, but this is a misunderstanding. Amor Fati does not justify suffering, nor does it deny it. It changes how suffering is interpreted, not by explaining it away, but by refusing to treat it as an objection to life. Most philosophies attempt to make suffering meaningful by attaching it to a purpose. Suffering is said to purify, educate, redeem, or lead somewhere better. Nietzsche rejects this strategy. Purpose-based interpretations of suffering are forms of consolation. They tolerate pain only by postponing affirmation. Amor Fati abandons consolation entirely. It does not claim that suffering was good for you. It does not say that pain was necessary in order to become who you are. These narratives soften suffering by retroactively justifying it. Nietzsche refuses this softening. Instead, Amor Fati integrates suffering without justification. Pain is not redeemed, it is owned. It is accepted as part of the life one affirms, not because it served a function, but because it occurred. This distinction matters. To justify suffering is to imply that without its payoff, it would have been unacceptable. Amor Fati removes that condition. It affirms life even when suffering appears senseless. Nietzsche sees moralized suffering as a trap. When pain is treated as meaningful only if it leads to something else, life is once again placed on trial. Amor Fati ends the trial. Life no longer needs to be excused. This does not produce indifference. Amor Fati does not numb pain or diminish its intensity. It allows suffering to remain suffering. What changes is the secondary suffering, the resentment, the "this should not have happened," the demand that the world be different. Nietzsche is precise here. The greatest suffering is often not pain itself, but the resistance to it. Amor Fati removes that resistance. The wound remains, but the poison of resentment does not. This is why Nietzsche treats Amor Fati as the deepest form of affirmation. It affirms not despite suffering, but with suffering included, without appeal to compensation or meaning beyond life. Suffering under Amor Fati is no longer a reason to reject existence, nor is it a badge of virtue. It becomes part of the texture of a life that is affirmed in full. This does not make suffering desirable, it makes life undeniable. By integrating suffering without justification, Amor Fati completes the movement away from life denial. Nothing is filtered out, nothing is explained away, nothing is used as leverage against existence. This is the point at which affirmation stops negotiating. Nietzsche is explicit that Amor Fati has nothing to do with optimism. Optimism reframes events so they appear bearable or beneficial. It looks for silver linings, hidden lessons, or eventual improvements. Amor Fati refuses all of this. Optimism still places conditions on affirmation. Life is accepted if it leads somewhere better, if it teaches something, if suffering can be redeemed by outcome. This conditional structure is precisely what Nietzsche is dismantling. Amor Fati does not reinterpret pain as opportunity. It does not soften reality by redescribing it. It affirms what happens without alteration. Nothing is made lighter, nothing is made meaningful by force. Nietzsche sees optimism as psychologically evasive. It shields the individual from the full weight of existence by insisting that things are ultimately fine. Amor Fati does the opposite. It allows things to be heavy and affirms them anyway. This difference explains why optimism often collapses under pressure. When events resist positive framing, optimism falters and resentment resurfaces. Amor Fati does not depend on framing, so it does not collapse when circumstances worsen. Optimism also demands emotional conformity. One is expected to feel hopeful, grateful, or positive. Amor Fati imposes no emotional requirement. One may feel grief, anger, or exhaustion and still affirm necessity. Nietzsche rejects optimism because it subtly reinstalls denial. It denies the full force of pain by insisting it must mean something good. Amor Fati allows pain to remain pain. What changes is not its interpretation, but the refusal to reject life because of it. This is why Amor Fati is often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it is more honest than optimism. It does not pretend that life is gentle. It affirms life even when it is not. Optimism seeks comfort. Amor Fati accepts discomfort without asking it to justify itself. Optimism tries to protect the individual. Amor Fati abandons protection. Nietzsche's affirmation is therefore harder than positivity. It offers no reassurance, no promise of improvement, and no emotional safety net. What it offers instead is a reconciliation with reality that does not depend on illusion. Amor Fati does not say, things will be okay. It says, this is what is, and I do not reject it. That distinction marks the final break from life denial. Nietzsche treats resentment as the deepest obstacle to affirmation, and Amor Fati marks its dissolution. Resentment is not merely anger or bitterness. It is a way of interpreting life that depends on blame, accusation, and imagined alternatives. It lives in the space between what happened and what should have happened. As long as resentment governs interpretation, fate cannot be loved. One may accept events outwardly, but inwardly life remains under protest. Amor Fati ends this protest entirely. Resentment always seeks an object. Someone must be responsible. Something must be at fault. Time itself becomes an enemy. Amor Fati removes the need for an enemy. What has happened is no longer measured against a moral ledger. This does not mean that harm is denied. Nietzsche does not pretend that injury did not occur. What disappears is the secondary injury, the demand that life answer for itself, that the past be rewritten, that existence justify its terms. Amor Fati collapses moral accounting. There is no final balancing of debts, no hidden tribunal, no future compensation. When fate is loved, Blame becomes meaningless because necessity is no longer experienced as injustice. This is why victimhood cannot survive Amor Fati. Victimhood depends on the claim that one's life has been unfairly shaped by forces beyond oneself. Amor Fati does not deny those forces. It denies their authority to define meaning. Nietzsche understands how destabilizing this is. Resentment provides structure. It offers orientation through opposition. When resentment dissolves, one must stand without grievance. Life is no longer organized around what was taken, denied, or lost. This is why Amor Fati feels empty before it feels full. The familiar narratives of accusation vanish. What remains is life without moral commentary. Only afterward can new interpretation arise. Ending resentment also ends revenge against time. Nietzsche often describes resentment as a form of hostility toward the past, the wish to undo what cannot be undone. Amor Fati accepts time without resistance. The past is no longer an enemy. This does not produce passivity. Without resentment, action becomes clearer. Energy is no longer consumed by blame. What one does next is no longer determined by what one opposes. Amor Fati therefore represents not forgiveness, but release. Nothing is excused, nothing is condemned. Life is affirmed without moral residue. This is why Nietzsche treats Amor Fati as the deepest yes. It is not loud, it is not triumphant, it is quiet, because it no longer needs an enemy. When resentment ends, affirmation no longer fights against anything, it simply stands. Nietzsche does not treat Amor Fati as a belief one holds or a feeling one cultivates. It is a way of interpreting life, a fundamental orientation that shapes how events are received, remembered, and integrated. Interpretation is decisive for Nietzsche. Events do not carry meaning on their own. Meaning arises from how life responds to what happens. Amor Fati names an interpretation in which necessity is no longer experienced as hostile, accidental, or unjust. This means that the same event can be lived in radically different ways. Under resentment, necessity feels like injury. Under endurance, it feels like burden. Under Amor Fati, it feels owned. Nothing about the event changes. What changes is the relation to it. Amor Fati therefore stabilizes affirmation. It does not depend on mood, success, or circumstances. Because it is interpretive rather than emotional, it can endure fluctuation. Joy may come and go, pain may intensify or fade. Amor Fati remains. This is why Nietzsche treats interpretation as more important than judgment. Judgment evaluates events against standards. Interpretation integrates events into life itself. Amor Fati does not ask whether something should have happened. It asks how what happened belongs to one's existence. By interpreting life this way, Amor Fati removes the constant friction between self and world. Life is no longer experienced as something that interrupts one's plans or violates one's expectations. It becomes the material through which one exists. This does not make life predictable or safe. Amor Fati does not control events. It controls response. It replaces resistance with integration. Nietzsche sees this interpretive shift as what allows affirmation to become durable. Without it, affirmation remains episodic, present in moments of strength, absent under pressure. Amor Fati carries affirmation through necessity. This also explains why Amor Fati cannot be reduced to a technique. Techniques aim at outcomes. Amor Fati is not outcome-oriented. It does not aim to feel better or to cope more effectively. It aims to remove the inner division that treats life as opponent. When Amor Fati governs interpretation, fate is no longer something that happens to the individual. It is something that happens as the individual's life. The boundary between self and necessity dissolves. Nietzsche's final affirmation is therefore not heroic or dramatic. It is structural. It reconfigures how life is understood at its deepest level. Amor Fati does not eliminate suffering, risk, or uncertainty. It eliminates the interpretation that these are reasons to reject life. In this way, Amor Fati completes the movement Nietzsche has been tracing from the beginning, from denial to confrontation to affirmation that no longer needs conditions. Nietzsche is careful never to present Amor Fati as something that can be taught, trained, or imitated. The moment love of fate becomes a lesson or a practice, it collapses into performance. One may act as if one affirms necessity while inwardly still resisting it. This is because Amor Fati is not a behavior. It is not a technique. It is not a posture one adopts in response to difficulty. It is the end result of a transformation in how life is interpreted, and transformations cannot be transmitted by instruction. Nietzsche distrusts examples here. When Amor Fati is illustrated through admired figures, it invites mimicry. Imitation produces appearance, not integration. One may copy gestures of affirmation while resentment remains intact beneath them. This is why Nietzsche avoids prescribing exercises. Exercises assume that a desired state can be reached by effort. Amor Fati arises when effort in the direction of resistance has become unnecessary. It appears indirectly as a byproduct of exhausted opposition. Attempts to teach Amor Fati often smuggle morality back in. They turn love of fate into an obligation, something one ought to achieve. This reintroduces guilt and failure precisely where Nietzsche is trying to dissolve them. Nietzsche's restraint here is deliberate. He understands that love of fate cannot be demanded without becoming its opposite. One cannot be commanded to love necessity. Love appears only when the desire to reject has disappeared. This is why Amor Fati often emerges quietly, without declaration. There is no announcement, no conversion moment, no dramatic shift. The individual simply stops placing life under accusation. What was once resisted is no longer fought. Nietzsche also recognizes that Amor Fati may appear temporarily and then vanish. It is not a permanent achievement. Changes in vitality, circumstance, or pressure can reopen resistance. This fragility is another reason it cannot be taught as a stable state. By refusing to teach Amor Fati, Nietzsche protects it from becoming ideology. Ideology freezes living interpretations into rules. Amor Fati must remain fluid, responsive, and alive. This is why Nietzsche writes of it sparingly and obliquely. He gestures rather than instructs. He names it only after everything else has been dismantled, when the reader may recognize it in themselves or not. Amor Fati is therefore not something one acquires. It is something that happens when resentment no longer has a role to play. When it appears, nothing needs to be said. Life is no longer argued with. It is lived. Nietzsche treats Amor Fati as his final yes to life because nothing lies beyond it that could deepen affirmation further. After nihilism has stripped away inherited meanings, after will to power has explained value creation, and after eternal recurrence has tested affirmation under the heaviest weight imaginable, Amor Fati completes the movement. What makes this final is not that it ends thinking, but that it ends resistance. Amor Fati does not seek transcendence. It does not point beyond life to a higher realm, a future redemption, or a perfected state. Nietzsche rejects all such gestures as remnants of denial. Loving fate affirms life as finite, contingent, and necessary without asking for more. This is why Amor Fati is not heroic. It does not dramatize affirmation. It does not posture. It does not conquer. It settles. Life is no longer experienced as a problem to be solved or justified. It is accepted as the field in which one exists. Nietzsche's final yes is therefore quiet. It does not shout because it no longer argues. It does not demand agreement because it no longer needs validation. It stands without appeal. This also explains why Nietzsche does not offer anything beyond Amor Fati. Any next step would reintroduce conditionality, a suggestion that life must still achieve something to be acceptable. Amor Fati closes that door. To love fate is to love the necessity of becoming, including decay, loss, and limitation. Nothing is filtered out. Nothing is postponed. Life is affirmed without remainder. This does not make life easier. It makes it undeniable. Nietzsche's philosophy does not end in comfort or instruction. It ends in a stance, a way of standing in relation to existence in which resentment has fallen away and affirmation no longer negotiates. Amor Fati is not a solution to life. It is the refusal to treat life as something that requires one. That refusal is Nietzsche's deepest affirmation and his last word.